Dead Art Studios Paint and Chat, and today we're working on this little painting that I started in my previous Paint and Chat, which was about Paul Cézanne. Today we're going to talk about Richard Hambleton, who's a New York street artist, born in Canada originally, but did a lot of his work in New York in that sort of famous graffiti and pop art early 1980s art scene, which was sort of dominated by the likes of Basquiat, Keith Haring, and Andy Warhol, kind of overarching over all of that. And Hambleton was central to the beginnings of that, more so maybe than Basquiat. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to try and connect it to this little abstracted landscape I'm making down here. And we're going to see if we can make a pretty piece of art with this sort of new sort of type of painting that I'm trying out, which is mixed media, I guess. So we've got the gloss medium and we've got a bit of paper, so kind of papier-mâché, but then it's staying two-dimensional really. We've got a bit of relief, a bit of texture on the painting, but overall we're going for a pretty traditional style. So we're going to start with some acrylic paint, and I'm going to use burnt sienna and try and build up the back bit here a little bit, where I feel like we're trying to create the shape of the little mountain Higator, and it's kind of just showing itself there. Originally when we were doing this, it was all kinds of chaos in the last video. I'll put the link in the description if you want to check it out. And we were trying to do a multi-point perspective thing, and we did sort of get some multi-point perspective, but then after a while this kind of morphed into a new thing, but we do still have the outlines of what I would think looks to me like Higator, so we're going to try and get that in there, and then we're going to think about the foreground and what we might do about that. Derbyshire, the Peak District, at least the dark peak of the Peak District, is famous for its heather moorlands, and I was thinking it'd be nice to try and finish this off with some purple specks, something like that, maybe gloss, to represent the sort of flowering heather, which reminds me so much of home and where I grew up. But first, before we can tackle that, we need to try and get the structure done here at the back. So we're going to get a yogurt pot lid. I'm going to put some paint in there and just squeeze a little bit in, and then we're going to add some gloss medium and some water just to thin it down a bit to start with. We can experiment with the amounts we want. This is a very liquidy gloss medium. You can get gels as well, which is quite good for this sort of decoupage, collage, papier-mâché type thing. I'm going to give it a little spray with some water from this spray bottle, just to wetten it up. Wetting it up, maybe moisten it up would probably be a better term, wouldn't it? There we go. And then we're going to think about how we're going to do it. I think for this, I probably want to almost mould the paper, shape it a bit. If we just put flat sheets on, it's going to look a bit odd. I think we want it a bit more sort of textured, a bit more sort of scrunched up, like I'm almost modelling it. Let's have a look. Maybe something like that. And I think if I'll put it under the camera. Maybe if we sort of dab it down a bit, make it a bit more pulp-like. Then we can start pulling bits away and placing it on. I think I'll probably end up using my fingers like I always do. And let's get a bit on. Let's have a look. I mean, as always, this will no doubt go totally how I'm not expecting it. But there you go. That's what we're going to roll with. Already the brown sort of off up into the what I would have called the sky, but we're not going to worry too much about that. We can paint over with some more appropriate colours. That's not too bad. So Richard Hambleton, he was born in Vancouver, Canada in, I believe, the 1950s. I'll flash it up with his picture. And he died in 2017, relatively recently. And he is famous for originally doing street art, or as he liked to call it, public art, because he wanted the public to engage and see it. And his first pieces were what were called the mass murder pieces, and they were, you know, these ideas in the movies where you get the white line of where somebody is in like a Columbo or Poirot film or something, I don't know, where the person has unfortunately been murdered and they've drawn a white line around it. Well, he was doing that kind of with spray paint and then putting a big red splash in the middle. He was using volunteers to draw around them and then putting a big splash of red paint in the middle and trying to get the look of a sort of blood splatter. And the idea, of course, was to shock and maybe ultimately to amuse people, because it probably wouldn't take them too long to figure out that this was not a real crime scene. And he did these in New York, and then he also moved around and did them in lots of sort of cities in America, in Texas and all over and everything. And then he also took them he didn't take the mass murder paintings or public art pieces around the world. He moved on to what it was called his Shadowmen, which was silhouettes. So the idea again was to shock, I guess. I'm going to use the back end of this brush to try and shape this onto here. The idea was to shock, and you'd be walking along the streets at night in New York, and you'd happen upon a shadow man. Sometimes they were high up on walls and buildings in strange places, or sometimes they'd just be on corners, which would probably be quite spooky if you saw them. And they were just silhouetted people, but he did them quite cleverly, and they had quite a lot of gesture in them. They had a little bit of depth and sort of perspective to them, and he'd have to paint them very, very quickly, and that would lead to this sort of very loose, splashy style, but also he was quite precise and very skilled in the way he did it, and this made quite a name for him. At that time in New York, that scene was very popular, and sort of artists in general, and musicians and designers and actors and everyone were all involved. Keith Haring was there, Basquiat, who originally painted a skull over one of Hambleton's Shadowmen to try and make a better name for himself. He was painting under the graffiti name with his colleague or friend, Samo, for same old shit. And before he became a sort of famous gallery artist, he was doing this, and he painted one of his sort of famous skulls over a Hambleton piece to make a name for himself. So they're all there in this sort of melting pot of 1980s pop art and street art culture doing this stuff. And he did eventually then have the mind to take these shadow men to other countries, so like London, Rome, Paris, things like that. So he was minded to try and spread his art all around the world, and that helped him gain a name. Now recently he's been pushed quite a lot in some of the sort of high street and commercial galleries and galleries in general, because he probably didn't fulfill the prices, let's say, that Basquiat went on for hundreds of millions of dollars. Basquiat obviously died when he was 27 as part of that sort of famous 27 gang of mainly musicians who died so young. And in some ways that's probably made his artwork, because it's limited, sell for a lot of money. Now people are sort of moving on and realising that Hambleton had such a sort of instrumental parts in the beginning of this art culture at the time, and so now they're pushing his work quite hard, and it's great work. He did move on to do these sort of shadow men in gallery pieces, so they will be displayed in galleries, and he did make prints of them and things like that, and he would also do commissions, and people would ask for certain kinds of shadow men and they would do them for him. Later on in his career, he moved on to doing, I'm just going to spray this with some water to try and thin out this brown paint on the top that sort of leaked, because I had a wispy look to this, and it's sort of vanishing, so I'm going to get it back. Yes, later on in his career he moved on to doing what he called the beautiful paintings, which were landscapes, much like this one, quite abstracted, but definitely landscapes. And he saw those as sort of a reaction to the fact that figurative art was so important and sort of mainstream in the galleries and everything like that. Everything had to be figurative. And he was like, no, I'm going to paint landscapes instead. Very nice ones. And that's how this kind of links in a little bit to what I'm painting now, which is why I thought I'd chat about him today while trying to get some of the work done that I have been trying to fit in around the Christmas schedule. I mean, it's difficult. If this is not your full-time job, and then to justify time away from the family and the chores and things like that, it's a hard one to do, but I always do try and do it. Now, I'm taking off a lot of this, and I'm starting to wonder whether it's the right move at all to get this brown on here, because I did like it more before. Let's press it in and try and leave it more like that. I think that works quite well. And we do really want a bit of brown in there to try. I mean, the rocks of the Peak District, they're not very brown. They're sort of more like silvery, black, dark. I mean, the dark peat gritstone is quite more in the greys, I would say. But I've got plenty of burnt sienna needs using, and we're just having a play, aren't we? So I am planning on using this technique for some bigger pieces. So this is nice and small, and really the plan is just to sort of hone and refine it a bit and see what we can do with it, and then hopefully move it on to some bigger, more impressive pieces. So yeah, Hambleton, he had quite a long life. Died in his 60s in 2017. He did have a lifelong drug addiction problem. I mean, addiction may not be the right word, because he was a functional drug user. He did lots of art and lived to a reasonable age, unlike Basquiat, who unfortunately died so young. So in that respect, he kind of managed, but I think it did affect his work and how he thought, and also his relationships with people around him. There is a documentary on his life, which I haven't seen. I want to try and source. Obviously, I always try and look for these things for free first on YouTube. Sometimes when they're a bit older, you can see them, can't you, for free? Well, this one I've not, so I would like to see it. It just means that I need to find the time to sort of get around to looking for it and seeing where I can watch it. So yeah, he did these beautiful paintings, but that's kind of how his career was. He had these beautiful paintings, and then he had his gesture paintings. Now, to move on from his Shadowmen pieces, he did what he called the American Hero or Marlboro Man pieces, which was the sort of famous American cowboy on a bucking horse. And he took what he learned from doing his gesture work in the Shadowmen pieces into the silhouettes of this very movement-based painting around the sort of idea of an American hero, just kind of not ripped off, but, copied from the Marlboro Men adverts at the time, which if you're of a certain age, you'll probably remember. And these are really, really impressively done with shadow and light direction coming in and everything, but still keeping that idea of it just looking like the paint's kind of thrown on there. It really is something quite difficult to achieve, I think, and I think it's really worth looking at Hambleton and taking him and putting him more centrally into the story of art. Obviously, people, curators, art historians make up a narrative of art history, and maybe now they're making up a new one. Maybe it suits the market or whatever. But I think in terms of his actual ability and what he brought to the street art and pop art and public art scene, I think it's definitely worth him being sort of more seriously looked at. I'm just painting this in now a bit and trying to figure out how we're going to get this. I was liking this before, and now I'm sort of like, have I messed it up? I'm just going to pull it in a bit there. Down there. I'm not sure we have totally messed it up. I think we've still got the idea of some kind of miniature mountain or landmark in the background. I think that's kind of working. Let's try making sort of like a thin sausagey sort of piece. Put that in. So it does have quite the guitar has quite a pronounced and level top. It's quite a strange little piece of geology, and to some extent may have been engineered a bit as well, like the stones moved by people throughout history. Right, let's have a look at that. That's not sure how successful we're being. The key is to keep going and just see what happens. We're allowed to pivot at any time that we want. I would say though that is what makes a great artist, someone who has a vision and sets out to do it and completes it, much like Hambleton. Throw out a Shadowman painting in like 5 minutes and it'd look really, really good and well done. And in some ways it's not always the amount of time spent on something that gives it its value, but sometimes it's the skill executed in it, which of course takes time in the background, doesn't it? Or sometimes is on occasion just pure ability that you can be born with. I do believe that is, some people think that anything can be achieved with practice. I'm not sure. I think some people have natural abilities that others do not, and it's good to seek those out and take advantage of them if you have them. They're gifts. All right. Okay, it's not too shabby. I think I'm getting somewhere with it. So the pop art and graffiti scene of the 1980s in New York, the New York art scene, is sort of follow on from perhaps abstract expressionism, Jackson Pollock, Rothko, those kind of things. It kind of extends from that in a way via Andy Warhol. And it's an interesting time because in some ways I think it starts to put a pause on the end of art history as we understand it when we think about Renaissance, Impressionism, Picasso, and all this. The story that's being told, at least by the historians. There's all these other things on the outside that are not necessarily being placed into the centre for us to look at and read about. But I do feel that that scene is starting to mark a sort of hiatus, an end point to that particular story of art history. And I think like Basquiat and such were using influence from Picasso, and then we've also got bits of the sort of abstract expressionism, the movement painting of Pollock, where action painting, isn't it, is the correct term, where he was sort of splashing the paint around. That goes a little bit into Hambleton's work, and it's all been sort of pulled up and it's been pushed into the street and the mainstream and the public, and then disseminated out through media, mass media at the time. And, you know, with the advent of TV and the beginnings of MTV and this big sort of central culture where it's disseminated, and you had the feeling that it was kind of cool and underground, but then at the back of sort of like, maybe MTV is a good example, you have these sort of corporations slowly sneaking in and maybe sending it out and manipulating it a little bit. And that's sort of the precursor to where we are now in many ways with, you know, the advent of your device, your iPhone or your Android device, and the way sort of it's all disseminated into no central sort of mainstream culture where we're all following along. I mean, you had the alternative culture of like rock music versus pop music back in those days, didn't you? And that's kind of gone. It's just a big mixture of everything, and some would say now just absolute, maybe nothingness, just slop is probably the most appropriate word that people are using right now, but I'm not sure that's true. You have to have a look around and dig through it all and you can find things. But I think the idea of a super famous artist like Basquiat, like Keith Haring, like Andy Warhol, I think that's disappeared for now because of the way culture and information and media is used. So for me, it's sort of where I start to peter off from the interest in art history. I love all kinds of painting and stuff like that, and I'm definitely keeping up with the modern stuff that's happening now, the contemporary stuff that's happening now. The Turner Prize has just been announced again. That's certainly very interesting art this year, I think, and I've been looking into and learning about that, and I certainly love the vibrant colours. You should check it out if you're interested. But yeah, I think the sort of art history starts to end here at the sort of Hambleton, Basquiat, Warhol era. And we do have a little bit maybe afterwards where we can talk about like the British pop artists and people doing installations and things, the Damien Hirsts and the Tracy Emins, and there's definitely something to be added there. And then maybe Banksy now. And it's interesting that Hambleton probably influenced Banksy quite heavily in terms of like how Banksy does with his stencil work, creating that sort of silhouette. That's quite similar to what Hambleton doing, but he was doing it freehand with a brush. So it's a very interesting time in art for me, and we'll definitely be having a look at more of that as well on Paint and Chat. Right, I'm going to try and work on this a bit more seriously now for a bit, and then I'll come back and show you what I've managed to achieve or potentially destroy. Okay, so I've been painting for about an hour now, and what I've got is this, as you can see here. I've used some oranges, which I've sort of been putting on bits of orange paper, and reds and greens, and some yellows as well. Now, what I did do was, as I was putting the layers on, I realised I was covering up subsequent layers, sort of previous layers with subsequent layers, and I thought, well, that's kind of silly. I've just put some nice cadmium yellow on, and now I've covered it up with cadmium orange. You can't see it anymore. So what I did was I went and got my little blade, which I like to use, and I scraped back, and it's created quite an interesting effect because sort of the wet part of the painting I could move and pull back to the drier parts underneath and reveal some of the previous layers as well. So I've got the yellow here, the orange on top, and then I've got the greens down here mixing with some of the yellows and browns. We've still got the outline, I think, of Higator, and it's still got that abstract look to it. So overall, I'm pretty happy with it. I am going to finish it as a little piece of painting, as a little artwork on its own, but then I do think I'm going to push forward with this technique on a larger scale and see what we can do with it. I think it could be used for both sort of like realistic and abstract work quite well if you wanted to. I quite like it. I'm not pretending I've invented this. It's just something I've stumbled upon myself, and I'm sure lots of people have been working with paper and paint for many a year. Now, Richard Hambleton, certainly a very interesting artist. If you get the opportunity to go and see any of his artwork, you might be in some high street galleries, at least prints on a large scale to get some of the impact maybe there. And I do think he's a very interesting and worthwhile artist looking at. I hadn't heard of him myself until recently, and that's why I brought him to your attention. Dead Art Studios. See you next time.